Hello, I'm here with Peter Victor, who is a professor at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. Peter, thanks very much for being with us this afternoon.
Very good to be here. Thanks.
Peter, you've trained as both an economist and you've also had a background in environmental studies, and it's an interesting mix because normally when people speak about the economy and the environment, they're spoken of as trade-offs. In fact, doing something about the environment is almost seen as a negative externality in regard to growth. And you've spent much of your academic career challenging that prevailing paradigm.
Yes, well, actually my formal training is in economics. All of the environmental studies and environmental science I've had to learn as I went along. But it goes back to when I was a PhD student at UBC doing my doctorate in economics. And it was at a time when the environmental movement was just getting going. And I was interested in how is it that a whole economy does this damage to the environment on which it depends. So that's where my inquiry started. And in fact, for now 40 years, I've pursued that not just as an academic. I worked as a public servant and I worked as a consultant for many years.
And in the course of your work, you've pointed out that the metric that we generally use is growth, GDP growth in particular, and you've challenged that. You said that's maybe not the best way to measure economic success and indeed in overall happiness. And in fact, it's an aberration because I think before the Second World War, we didn't even use GDP. It was not it was a concept with which we weren't familiar.
Right, no, that's true. And it is an interesting history. GDP was measured by some academics and scholars leading up to the Second World War, and that war was one of the great impetuses for research on GDP because particularly the Allied countries wanted to know what were their economies capable of producing so that they could assure themselves that they were putting the maximum effort into the war. And then at the same time, we also had the influence of John Maynard Keynes, who taught us that level of expenditure was a direct determinant of the level of unemployment, and that was a huge concern in those times because of the Great Depression. And so you had these events coming together. You had the need to measure the output of the economy in order to fight and win the war, and you had the academic insights of Keynes saying how important it was to measure expenditure because we needed it to deal with unemployment. But since then, it sort of took on a life of its own. People began to say, economists and others, that, well, actually growth in GDP was going to be considered really significant. And I would say that in the last 3-4 decades, we've virtually identified progress with an increase in GDP. Well, it was never intended as that. The originators of GDP never thought it was a useful measure of welfare, and so it's a bit of a puzzle then as to why we still rely on it so much.
And there's some older studies, for example, Richard Easterlin at USC is one, and there's also been people like Enrico Giovannini in Europe, and indeed Joe Stiglitz, who have talked about using different kinds of metrics to measure economic well-being, and that's one of the things that you've done as well. And of course, you've incorporated environmental aspects into that equation as well.
Yes. Well, what I try to do is to build a model of the economy in which GDP is one of the metrics that's in there, but so are many other things that we're interested in, including some environmental dimensions. And then I use the model to say, well, you know, if we ran the economy differently, could we achieve all sorts of valuable objectives, such as full employment and no poverty, and a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and fiscal balance? In other words, could we do all of these things without relying on economic growth?
And your conclusion was?
Well, look, this kind of work is preliminary,
yeah.
But the book I published in 2008 certainly included my preliminary conclusions that yes, it is possible to frame an economy that operates in that way. But since then, I've been doing more in-depth and more ambitious work of the same kind in collaboration with Tim Jackson from the UK.
It is a very interesting question, though, because, for example, Japan, I think, is a classic case where you have an economy which is, if you look at the classic GDP paradigm, GDP growth paradigm, we always speak about Japan as, since the late 1980s, as the lost 3 decades. Now, in fact, it's overstated because even during that period, on the narrow measure of GDP, they did experience periods of growth. But on many other metrics, for example, unemployment, education, health benefits, they've actually scored better than we have here in Canada or in the United States. And indeed, there are a lot of people that have suggested in the wake of the 2008 great financial recession that would that we had the lost decades that Japan has had.
Yeah, well, In particular, Japan experienced an increase in GDP per capita, and that had a lot to do with their stable, if not declining population. So it's not just GDP. It ought to be, if you're going to use GDP, at least do it in relation to the size of the population. But one of the encouraging things in all of this is the interest there now is in alternative measures. Now, to my way of thinking, there's far too little interest, and there's far too little official support from statistical agencies, for example, from government departments, to develop proper metrics for measuring our progress in many different dimensions. But at least we're seeing some initiatives. There's the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, which, despite all its weaknesses, is an effort in that direction. There's the measure of Australian progress, which is a very interesting example of an attempt by a statistical agency to give a much better representation of how Australia is doing. And I don't know if this will interest you, but in my class that's just finished, I did it both with my undergraduates and graduates. I gave them the following opportunity. I divided them up into groups. Each group had to pick a particular alternative measure of progress and apply it to a jurisdiction for which it's never been applied before. And it was a bit of a gamble. You never know as a teacher, is this going to really pay off? The students loved it. The enthusiasm, the work they put in, the quality of the work they did, it was fantastic. And you know what it says to me as a teacher is that this generation understands that things are not going well, that we don't have a good handle on it, and we need better ways of measuring how we're doing.
And I think it also, the other value about incorporating the environmental elements into it is that I think it gets to the real constraints that we have in economic growth. And normally, in particularly in the economics profession, we talk about financial or fiscal sustainability. And we talk about it as if there is a financial constraint, when in fact, when you're dealing with a country that creates its own currency, there's no financial constraint per se. But there is obviously a constraint as far as real resources go, and that's where the real limits come into play.
Right. Well, this comes then to the fundamental core of what I do, which is all about how to understand the economy in relation to the environment. It's not a question of having the economy here and the environment there and worrying about trade-offs. The economy is a subsystem of the biosphere. It lives within it. Everything we do in the economy, everything we produce, everything we consume comes from nature. So what we do is we take materials and energy from nature, we process them, we add value, but then we discard them. And it's all in accordance with two fundamental physical laws. The first law of thermodynamics, which says that you don't create or destroy any material or energy, you just
redistribute it, actually.
Well, you just refashion it.
Refashion it, yeah.
But then you have to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And the second is that, particularly with respect to energy, anytime we use energy, we reduce its capacity to do further work. And now, to my mind, and I think to a growing number of economists, if you don't factor those considerations into an analysis of an economy now in the 21st century, when we're having such large and demonstrably negative impacts on the environment, you'll never come up with coherent economic policy. So economic policy, to me, has to be blended with environment and resource policy. They have to be part of the same package. We cannot afford to separate them.
They can't work in opposition to one another. And in fact, I've always had the sense that we don't really measure economic growth properly, in the sense that, as I say, we view the environment as a cost input, rather than viewing it as a benefit. So, for example, we don't actually measure an event like Fukushima takes place, the nuclear disaster in Japan. And we at that point, we can see that there's a huge, quote-unquote, economic cost to it. But in the meantime, and in the run-up to that period, what a lot of people will say is, well, it's a type of power that gives very, very low greenhouse emissions. It's relatively safe, et cetera, et cetera. And so this whole dynamic of what happens in the event of a Fukushima type event or a Chernobyl type event is ignored in the calculations.
Well, some people would say it's worse than that, is that when you have a crisis like that, what happens? We spend money. We spend money, GDP goes up. So if you just focus on GDP, you get a completely perverse impression of the catastrophe. But we shouldn't just think it's a matter of these spectacular issues that go wrong. It's an ongoing, daily, momentary requirement that we have for resources and for energy, and these continue to rise. There's a lot of talk about decoupling, the idea that you can somehow have GDP rising indefinitely and at the same time reduce the requirements for materials and energy. There's really no evidence that that's that has happened or is likely. Well, you can't have evidence about it whether it's likely to happen, but you certainly have to think if it hasn't happened in the past, with all the attention we've now been putting on these issues for at least 20 years, why would we think that's a viable way into the future? So I come back to, I think, one of the earlier questions you asked me, and that is, well, we need to rethink what economic growth was supposed to do for us anyway. Was it supposed to make us happy? Well, there's not a lot of evidence that there's a relationship between rising GDP and increasing happiness, at least in countries that are as well off as this one is. And so it's time to then think much more clearly about what are the causes, what are the contributing factors to happiness, and answer those questions, and then push to one side this thing of GDP. I still think it tells us some useful information. For example, if you're working in the Department of Finance and you want to know how much tax revenue you can obtain, then you'd want to know, well, how much money is being spent in the economy. That's fine. Use it for the purposes for which it was intended, but don't misuse it for in the way that sadly it is.
Well, the other aspect is, and it comes back to this question of trade-offs again, is whenever we get one of these geopolitical shocks, particularly in regard to the Middle East, it seems that there is always these environmental concerns get swept to the side. So, for example, in the U.S., the turbulence in places like, say, Libya or in Iran, and the possibility of attacking, et cetera, is used as justification for Keystone, in spite of many of the multiple environmental risks which have been pointed out. And likewise in this country, the government seems to be operating against prevailing mainstream opinion over the last 20 years, because it has talked about making Canada an energy superpower, and the exploitation of the oil sands, as they like to call it here, tar sands, to its critics, is not something which is in any way questioned.
Yes, well, you know, to me, it comes back to this mistaken priority we give to economic growth, because what happens is, whenever some alternative or some other objective is put forward, whether that's preserving green space, protecting endangered species, protecting the Great Lakes from contamination, what's the first sort of questions that are asked? What will it do for our economy? What will it do for economic growth? What will it do to productivity? Will it hurt competitiveness? These are peculiar criteria, if you ask me, to judge measures which are intended to make us live better on the planet.
And so the questions like, what sort of public goods should we be producing to help enhance our citizens' well-being, which is also contribute to growth in a broader sense, is not something that's often addressed in these debates.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why I welcome this opportunity to have this interview so that we can maybe draw more attention to these
And I think it's important that and I sometimes think that the environmentalists don't help their cause, because they sort of say, well, you know, they come across as anti-consumption. And the point I've often made is, look, consumption is not just, you know, having that third flat screen TV, or having 3 cars in the garage, or having a 20,000 square foot home. It actually it might mean, for example, cultivation of public spaces that our citizens can enjoy. Those sorts of things can also contribute to economic well-being, economic sustainable economic growth, and yet they're not really captured in these statistics, and they're not really discussed in those terms, actually. But that's obviously an important way in which we can redefine consumption, for example.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't call it economic well-being anymore, though. I would just say well-being.
Social well-being, if you want.
There are various contributors to well-being, and let's look at all of those. From an economic point of view, one of the things I'd like to emphasize here is, I think that what this says is that we've got to rethink our investment strategy and our investment priorities. Because to me, investment is what links the present to the future. The investment decisions today, the infrastructure we build today, the consumer durables we buy today, are determined for quite a long period of time into the future what future generations, what ourselves and those who follow us, are going to have to spend to keep that infrastructure going. And if we want the kinds of things you were suggesting before, more community spaces, more access to nature, then that suggests a different pattern of investment. And the interesting questions, and why I like a lot of the work that INET is trying to do, is can we finance such a shift in our pattern of investment, given the kind of financial system and institutions that we have in place? And I'm working on that at the moment. as others are, and I don't know what the answer is yet.
Well, but you have already written things about this. In fact, I believe you wrote a paper in about 2008, 2009, where you talked about Canadian adherence to, for example, the Kyoto protocols, which it's subsequently been in breach of it for many times. But you sketched out a scenario where one could reorient policy, where you would enhance this social economic well-being and still achieve, even within the metrics of conventional GDP growth.
Yeah. Well, no, that's true. It's possible to lay out a scenario. Look, when you think about it, if we look at ourselves as a $1.5 or $2 trillion economy spread across 35 million people, you can do an awful lot with that kind of income. You don't have to commit it in the way that we do at the moment, with such an emphasis on consumer goods and so little emphasis on community goods, if I can use that term. And so that's why it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that when an economy reaches the kind of level of output that we have, you don't actually have to keep it growing in order to think we've got enough resources available to us. It's a question of priorities.
And it's also a question of what is the next great role of the state? Bill Janeway points this out in his latest book, and he talks about historically how great phases of innovation have been accompanied by a huge role in the state. And he talks about the railway boom, for example. He talks about the telecommunications boom, the internet boom, which came out of course, defense expenditure. And he said, the state is in some ways ideally placed to be a leader in terms of the next great role, because it can be a loss leader by virtue of the fact that it has infinite financial as opposed to real resources. And he said the logical next place to go would be the transformation of our economy into a green economy. And he said the state is uniquely placed to play that role. And in one sense, it's the grand unifying idea which would, in a sense, re-legitimize government and get us away from this notion of predatory crony capitalism, which I think afflicts many of the Western democracies right now.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with that view. Sometimes, though, and I didn't hear him make that pitch, I have to say, but sometimes people who talk in those terms are still hankering after growth.
Yeah.
That it's green growth. It's growth we want, but we'll green it. And it comes back to the point I was making earlier, that about decoupling. That perspective works from the assumption that it's possible to keep increasing the value of the goods and services that the economy produces at the same time as we reduce its requirements for materials and energy. There may be some scope for doing that for a little while, but it's hard to imagine how you can keep the one number going up and the other one going down. In the end, it would sort of mean we're growing all of our food in a flower pot.
And so really what the measure we should be looking at is something like GDH, gross domestic happiness.
Well, yeah, just like they do in Bhutan, or there's the Genuine Progress Indicator, there's a Happy Planet Index. There are lots of candidate alternative measures. Where we are falling short is we are not putting anything like the resources we should into developing more robust measures of alternative measures of progress.
And I'm hoping that this interview will provide a spur to some of our policymakers towards moving in that direction, as you eloquently pointed out in much of your work. So,
well, that would make me happy too.
Yes, Peter, thanks very much for joining us. It's been great, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about this again soon. Thanks very much.